watching
Trump,
where the smart money is headed versus, looking at these very, let's say, zoomed in symptoms.
well, mainstream media, and look, they don't tell the truth about anything. All right. They just don't. It's not, they are fake news. And it's not just about politics. I mean, down here in Florida, they were like, oh, there's going to be, a hurricane, there's going to be a 10-foot wall of water, and everybody flees, and turns out to be 6 inches. I mean, so they will always sensationalize whatever it is to get you, like the joke is down here, tune in and we'll tell you 1 minute you're going to die. Um, and it's just the way it is. So in finance, it's the same problem. Mainstream media, they're not going to put me on because basically I'm not going to play their game. Oh, let's see, the Fed's going to raise interest rates. So how far down do you think the stock market will go? If you look at, I wrote a book which we will republish. It was called The Greatest Bull Market in History back in 1986. And I did all the research, read all the newspapers before and going into 29 and the crash, etc. And what struck me was when interest rates went up before 29, everybody cheered and the stock market went up. Why? The government wasn't the biggest borrower, but they basically said that proves there's still demand for money. Look at it objectively. Interest rates collapsed in recessions and depressions. 29 dropped from 6% to 1%. It dropped dramatically 2007 to 2010. So did lower interest rates mean improvement of the stock market? Come on, just, this is the nonsense that mainstream media puts out all the time. It's the same fictional, myths that they constantly state. And so they're not going to call somebody like me who's going to say, sorry, you're wrong. They don't want it. No way. Absolutely no way. So, I mean, they have to have their pet people who are going to say the same thing all the time. Unfortunately, that has really brainwashed a lot of people, I guess. Oh, stock market up, and lower interest rates, but rates go up, then the stock market should crash. Just step back and take a look, and you'll see that interest rates rose all the way through the Trump rally. We didn't pay attention to that. Oh, it's Trump. They called it the Trump rally, but the Fed was raising rates all the time.
Marty, with this, let's say, this objective view of, as you said, the business cycle, how do you think this ends up affecting countries like, let's say, specifically Canada and Mexico, if these higher, let's say, 25% tariffs get implemented? What happens to these economies when and if these tariffs get implemented like that?
Oh, they economically decline. Mainly because they're surviving on selling stuff to us.
Mhm.
From Trump's perspective, if we have a trade deficit and we put on the tariffs, then our deficit declines. From their perspective, that's a trade surplus. You put on the tariffs, they decline. So, unfortunately, I think what Trump doesn't take into consideration is that what the tariffs would also do is reduce their economies. So if they reduces it, you then have the risk of creating a contagion.
Mhm.
So you look at like the Great Depression or even going back to the Panic of 1857. I mean, these things are international. So you create a contagion that just becomes like an economic flu and goes from one country to the next. I suggest reading, it's online for free. Read Herbert Hoover's memoirs for 1931 and talked about how capital acted like a loose cannon on the deck of a ship in like the middle of a hurricane. He said it was shooting off in every which direction so fast we couldn't figure out, get a committee to figure out what was happening. He was talking about how the gold was rushing from one currency to the next, and eventually it all came here. But, and then that pushed the dollar up so high because virtually all of Europe defaulted, including even Canada in 1931. And then the dollar was pushed up so high that an economist named George Warren advised FDR that, look, when Britain left the gold standard, all right, the economy inflated out and ended their depression. That's why Roosevelt, basically shut down the gold standard, domestic use. He wanted to fund his socialistic New Deal. So he confiscated the gold at $20.67 and then raised it to 35. That was profit for him to fund his socialistic agenda. And he eliminated gold domestically, which is the same argument behind a lot of these cryptocurrency things. So if they eliminated cash, okay, then, and all money in banks is just electronic. You can't go down and say, give me my cash. You got to go down there with the USB and say, here, stick it on here, please, So they view it as moving to digital would eliminate bank runs. And you'll hear them say, "Oh, we would also eliminate, crime, etc." How do you pay a hooker or something like? It's if there's no money. So, you hear those arguments too. But the main thing that I've heard is that digital currency would eliminate bank runs, and this is what Roosevelt did: take the gold out. Okay. And people can't go running down there. Give me my $20 gold piece. So it's more of a control factor, I guess.